Everybody, thank you for joining us today at our webinar. It is a pleasure to announce that all CCASA staff will be with you today, sharing a couple important highlighting issues related to Denim Day. So to start with, I would like to do a couple housekeeping announcements. Everybody is on mute at this time. Any questions can be typed into the question button or the chat box. The PowerPoint and handouts will be sent in a following email within the 48 hours. Let's be a little bit realistic. And at the end of this webinar, of course, we have our survey that we will really appreciate if you all fill it out and let us know what you think about it, and provide us with amazing ideas for follow-up webinars for the rest of the year. So with that being said, I would like to continue on. I would like to start by asking all of us online, who is with us today? I'm going to start hold on one second, we're using a different computer today. So we're going to start with the poll, and we want to know who the audience is. So please let us know who is with us today. There's different options there. Community-based, system advocates, sane or safe. Please let us know who you are, and that way we can get an idea and continue our presentation with you all. It seems like 74% community-based advocates, 21% system-based advocates, about 5% sane and safe. Please keep on going with letting us know. We're going to keep it up for a couple more seconds, and then we're going to be sharing that with you all. And after we share these final scores, we are going to introduce you to our presenters, which is all CCASA staff, which is amazing. We're all together in the same place today. Yay! Okay, let's see. We're going to share it with you all. See if it's coming. I shared it, and it says a 75% community-based advocate, 25% system-based advocates, about 4% sane, and no law enforcement and prosecutors. Oh, well, I guess we're going to be missing them today. But let's keep on going with our agenda today, and I'm going to continue on by letting all the staff introduce themselves. Hold on one second. This one. Yes, and we will start with our executive director.
Hi everyone, this is Bree Franklin. I'm the executive director with CCASA.
And this is Rana. I left the Capitol for a short bit to join everyone today on this webinar. We're really looking forward to it, and then you can catch me back at the Capitol.
Hello everyone, this is Josh Keeney. I'm the Training and Technical Assistance Coordinator with CCASA now. Hello.
And again, this is Agatha Morgan, the Program Director at CCASA, and thank you all for being with us today. So now we will continue our presentation.
All right, so this is Bree again, and today we're going to talk a little bit about the connection between rape myths and what kind of effect those have on sexual assault reporting dynamics. We're also going to talk a little bit about how the work we do around Denim Day ties into both of these things, as far as raising awareness about rape myths and hopefully raising awareness so that victims feel comfortable reporting. And so we're going to talk with you about how you can use some of this information in your own work in talking about rape myths and getting victims to report. So some of you, hopefully a lot of you, know the history behind Denim Day, but I'll tell you briefly for those of you who don't. So in the 90s in Italy, there was an 18-year-old girl who was raped by her 45-year-old driving instructor, and that driving instructor was later convicted and sentenced to jail. However, he appealed the sentence, and his case went to the Italian Supreme Court, where the case was overturned. The head judge released a statement arguing that because the victim wore tight jeans, he assumed that she must have helped the perpetrator remove her jeans and therefore consented. So, I think that's pretty familiar to a lot of us nowadays on what kinds of rape myths are out there about who can be raped and why, as well as I think, again, remembering this is in the 90s, we didn't have the social media that we do today, so the fact that this made national headlines or international headlines was really quite a big deal. I think in the last couple of years, particularly in the last year or two, you probably have all seen similar cases come up that really question, could that really have been rape? Or how judges are responding to these cases and the kinds of things they're saying. So the head judge in this case released the statement. So one of the things that happened was because of this verdict and how enraged they were, the women of the Italian parliament launched into immediate action, and they protested by wearing jeans on the steps of the Italian parliament building. And so their action in protesting and wearing jeans was the start of what we now know as International Denim Day. And that's why we wear jeans as a visible means of protest against these types of misconceptions around sexual assault. So although the jeans are a symbol of that particular case and how jeans were used as a myth and why rape could or couldn't happen in that case, they really are a good talking point for talking about all kinds of myths. And it's really great to say that our own legislature, led by a lot of the women of the legislature, but we also have a lot of the men involved, have been wearing jeans on Denim Day since we started, and I think every year as well they have made a proclamation on Denim Day and have talked about this case with their colleagues at the legislature, and it's great to have them also leading this movement. So I think you all probably know the answer to this question. We're going to do another poll here. But what are the causes of rape? We often hear, oh, she was drinking, or she was walking alone, or she was wearing jeans, so it couldn't have been rape. We're going to give you a poll to see what you think the causes of rape are. So I think your poll should be up now. If you want to start answering, wearing revealing clothing, walking alone, wearing the wrong shoes, drinking too much, or perhaps the rapist is the cause of rape. Looks like we've got about 95% of you saying the rapist is the cause of rape. We've got a couple folks saying wearing revealing clothing might cause rape, or drinking too much might cause rape. So we'll share that with you. So, I go back. What we know is that the only cause of rape is the rapist, because I can be drinking at a bar and go home and not get raped, right? The reason why I didn't get raped is because there wasn't someone there who chose to take advantage of that situation and rape me. I can also be wearing revealing clothing and go out dancing at a bar, and I may not get raped. So the factor in that equation is having someone there who's willing to take advantage of a situation and rape me. And some of the language we often use to talk about that is that individuals will identify someone who is vulnerable, accessible, or lacking in credibility. So if I'm drunk, I'm going to be more vulnerable, but that doesn't mean that my drunkenness caused my rape.
Hello everyone, this is Josh, and I'm going to pick up the next few slides here for our presentation. And so you see, you all may have seen this already being put out through some of our Denim Day communications that have been happening this month, but we know that sexual assault is the single most underreported violent crime in our culture, and in so many ways it's due to the victim-blaming dynamics that are created out of the myths that we are going to discuss today during our presentation. And we also see that the rates of assault, as well as the low reporting of the incidents, often increase when we look at specific environments like college campuses, also the military as well, those sorts of environments. And it's often because of the culture that is wrapped around inside that environment, and how much the myths are bought into, or the prevalence of those myths in those specific environments. So keep that in mind as we go forward looking at the myths that we're going to discuss today. To start off, or right before we jump into looking at some specific myths, just wanted to talk to you all about the common issues that do keep survivors from reporting. You have a list here, and I'm sure you all have seen lists that are very, very similar to these sorts of dynamics. Really does stem from, like what I was talking about previously, the prevalence of the myths inside a culture, and how often or how much are people buying into those myths. Rana will end up discussing later on in terms of how the CJ, the criminal justice system, incorporates some of these myths in our jurors, the lawyers, the law enforcement, how everybody's responding to survivors, and then also the survivor's perception of the ways people might respond because they are aware of these myths being present inside of our culture.
Okay, so this is Rana. Hi again, everyone. The first myth that we're really going to dive into is this idea that girls and women who wear revealing clothing are asking for it, and that men can't help themselves when enticed like this. I mean, first of all, I just want to start off that this is like pretty insulting to men, that they somehow cannot control themselves when they're surrounded by women wearing tank tops or something ridiculous like that. So I want to just start with debunking it there, that this is actually a really insulting myth when we talk about like the capacity of our men and boys to engage in sexual assault prevention education. But even more so, this idea that because what I'm wearing would incite violence towards me is just something that is untrue. And what we know is that rapists are looking to exploit vulnerabilities, and then also a second component of sexual assault is that access to victims. And so many perpetrators don't even recall what their victim was wearing when they're interviewed. So it's literally not about clothing, it's about vulnerabilities that survivor, like what Bree was mentioning earlier, and then access to that person. So this myth lends to cultural misconceptions that victims can in some way be seen as partially responsible for their own victimization. And the reason that I wanted to talk about this slide specifically is because that's really what we saw a lot with the juvenile sexting legislation this past session, where we had a lot of misguided beliefs that a victim of a privacy violation, that survivor who maybe was in a consensual relationship, consensually gave a photo of themselves to their partner, and then that partner further distributed the image without the victim's consent, and that was where the privacy violation occurred, that somehow we needed to create a policy that was going to punish victims for sending their own image. And CCASA and many of our stakeholders believe that that was just kind of one of these rape myths in a digital age, where we were saying that because a survivor took a picture of themselves and sent it, that was further distributed, that somehow that victim would be responsible for their own victimization. We think that that is way off base, and that where the actual abusive behavior occurred was in the privacy violation, was in the further distribution, and that victim should not have been held responsible. So we think that this idea of, because a victim is wearing some sort of revealing clothing does not mean that they were asking for it. It doesn't mean that the sexual assault was their fault. And we think that those types of beliefs are kind of being perpetuated just in a digital age, specifically with that legislation.
And this is Bree, and one reason why we know that wearing revealing clothing doesn't cause rape is because we know there are many cultures where women have to cover up completely and rape still occurs. So it doesn't really matter what they're wearing, it matters what the person who chooses to rape is doing.
So the next myth, in fact, is stranger danger. And this just simply is not true because, again, we're talking about access. And perpetrators are with greater access to victims. That's where the sexual assault is occurring. We know that 70% of sexual assault victims know and have some relationship with their attacker. And the effect on low reporting rate here is that this causes confusion for their survivor because acquaintance rape doesn't fit into our cultural stereotypes. So, for example, if this is a situation where the survivor and that survivor's sphere of influence or their peer group, the perpetrator is part of that peer group, the survivor may feel confused because the perpetrator might be seen as like a nice guy or a trustworthy friend within that peer group, and perhaps the survivor feels that no one in the peer group will believe the survivor if the survivor comes forward and talks about the abuse from the perpetrator because everybody in the peer group likes the perpetrator. And so I can kind of draw my own experience here from doing direct service where I worked with survivors of incest, and a lot of times within that familial dynamic, the survivor was really scared to come forward because coming forward and participating in some sort of reporting option, whether that be participating in the criminal legal system or even just coming to a confidential advocacy center for services, felt like a betrayal to the family and felt like perhaps the survivor was risking losing the support of their family because the abuser was one of the family. So that created some really complex dynamics and some reasons why a survivor may not want to engage in criminal legal but is still coming to our community-based advocacy centers to develop safety plans when it's a situation of acquaintance rape or familial or incest and things like that. Our next myth that we're going to look at is survivors putting themselves in the situation. Why did you go with them? Why did you let them in? And again, just kind of like repeating on the same key aspects that we're looking at with access and vulnerabilities. A perpetrator gaining the trust of their victim is often a key grooming tactic. And I think that this kind of translates a little into the juvenile sexting bill too, is that idea of why did you take a picture of yourself? Why did you place yourself in that position to be victimized? When simply, like, all that's doing is shifting the accountability off of the abuser, asking why did you feel like it was okay to abuse someone versus putting the blame on the victim of why did you put yourself in that situation. So this dynamic can cause the survivor to feel like they're responsible for allowing the situation to occur, and I think it's our job as advocates to really unpack that belief system when we're working with survivors, when we're working in the community, when we're working with community partners, to really place the accountability back on the perpetrator, that the reason that sexual assault occurred was because there was a rapist in the room, not because the survivor was in their own apartment or something like that.
Hello, everybody. This is Aguila. I'm going to continue with a couple of the myths that they're following. So if a victim chooses to drink or use drugs, they are culpable in what happened to them. So were you drinking or not? One of the very common myths that we hear all around. Again, all of these myths that we're going to be covering, basically what we're trying to clear up here is that our culture is really bases the culpability or the responsibility on the survivor, because and also is very gender based. If we see when we go out and drink, men are allowed to drink, men are allowed to have as many drinks as they want to, and very seldom we see somebody saying, well, if you were male identified, you were raped because you were drinking. We don't see that very often in our culture. So it is important to put the fact that alcohol does not negate the need of somebody to ask for consent, and it also is not the one the alcohol is not the one who causes the rape. Again, it goes back to the rapist. It's alcohol is used as a tool, but not necessarily is the reason for why women or anybody gets raped. Moving forward, the second myth that I'm going to talk about is the victim responsibility to say no. Did you say no? Did you do anything to stop the perpetrator? How many times did you say no? Which we also often see a lot when we go to when we go out and we're providing support to survivors on court. The very most important thing that we need to keep in mind and telling the survivor is that it's never their fault, and that if they say no, or if they try to stop the perpetrator from acting out their decision, it is not the responsibility of the victim. And the other important thing is that yes means yes, or everything else means no. That's something that we have been using right now, and it has been seen all around. But the responsibility is of the person who is acting it out and doing the act, and to asking the other person who they're engaging with is, are you okay with the next steps that we're going to take? So always asking and making sure the consent is available, it is there, and it's clear is most important. You have something to say?
Yeah, and this is Bree. I think the other important thing to keep in mind is that many victims, we know when they get in a crisis situation, have a fight, flight, or freeze response. And so, whoops, I'm taking over your thing. So saying no might be hard. And also, if it's somebody you know, it's that much harder to fight back or to say no, because particularly as women, we're socialized to be nice. When we fight back or say no, then we get told we're making too big of a deal of things, or we just don't know how to take a joke, or things like that.
Thank you, Bree. So moving along and going after what Bree was mentioning, it goes very well along with our next myth, which is talking a little bit about the freeze, flight, and fight. Again, the victim's responsibility to stop an attack. Why didn't you fight? We get to see all these different ways that we're being educated, or that we're being, how do I say this? Culture in our in TV, on the news, and the radio is always telling us like it's our responsibility to fight. There are some people are able to stop somebody from attacking them, but reality says no. There's even some research done in the military who is people who's really well trained, and they have the same response. When you're going into an attack, when you're being sexually assaulted, you are going to have three different ways to respond. One, it will be the freeze. One, it will be the flight, and one, the fight. But most of the time, the fight is not going to happen. It's very rare, very seldom that that's going to happen. So talking a little bit about this is very important to provide this information to survivors so they kind of understand, and they get to understand their feelings. They also get to understand their responses, so they are able to understand that it's not their responsibility. With kind of clarifying that they were not responsible for what happened to them. So a little bit more about the flight and fight and freeze is that it's important to talk a little bit when you're with the survivor. Let them understand their emotions and their feelings they were feeling in that moment, understanding the way that the body and their emotions respond to the attack, clarifying that the perpetrators have specifically used whatever tactics, alcohol, or they were very close friends and they waited for the right moment to do the move and attack the survivor and violate them. So understanding and explaining these different tactics to survivors, and explaining how the perpetrator really takes one step at a time and really plans out what they're doing is very important to help them up to move forward in the healing process.
And this is Reagan. What we know from studies on sex offenders is that they will use incremental violence, which means that they'll use enough violence as needed to get what they want. So sometimes fighting back can actually cause more violence to occur, so it's not necessarily the best choice for someone to fight back because then they could be hurt more. We also know that offenders do grooming behaviors, and when we hear that term we often think of grooming over a long period of time, but it can also be a shorter period of time, such as someone at a bar sitting really close and being within your space where you don't feel comfortable. But again, as a woman, we don't feel like we have the right or the ability to say, hey, don't sit so close to me, because people are going to be like, what's your problem? So they'll do things to test boundaries and see how far they can get until a victim feels like, oh, well, I didn't say anything back then, so now I can't, or until they find themselves in that situation where now they're in the midst of an assault versus being able to stop it before then. So those are important things to keep in mind too, is it's not always a good idea to fight back, and to let victims know that whatever they did was what they needed to do to survive and to be on this side of it, and now to deal with that.
Thank you, Bree. So helping, just to wrap up this slide, helping survivors understand the psychological process of trauma during and after the incident is one of the best ways to help them gain empathy and understand the process, and understand what the process that they went through, the trauma itself. Moving along to the next one, it's kind of a bridge to the one before. It is the myth of if a survivor changes their story, they must be lying. One that we see a lot in the courts, and even in the support, even in the communities. The communities itself tend to think that if they did not fight or if they changed that, then this person must be lying. So we need to change this myth about how trauma, educate the community and the survivors about how trauma memories work, how trauma is stored, and how it is really natural for somebody not to have the full recall of the story step by step, that it will become into you in pieces. And if we have the survivor changes the story, it might be because they were not completely remembering everything in that moment. So it's absolutely natural that they will not have a complete story from beginning to end about what happened to them. And it actually is very unnatural to hear somebody who remembers everything step by step. So the memories are in the body, and they're going to start remembering and things after a while when they're more relaxed, and if that even happens, they will get the stories later on.
And this is Bree again. We also know, looking back at some of these other myths that we talked about, that if a survivor was drinking or was taking drugs or did something that they think they're going to be blamed for, they may not share all of that information right away until a rapport has been built. And so sometimes that can also lead to not being believed, is their own fear of not being believed. Well, if I say that I was drinking, then you're not going to believe this really happened, so I won't say that, but then it comes out later.
Yes, thank you, Bree. So to wrap up this fact and myth, memories are often recalled in fragments and nonlinear manner. During the event, the amygdala is the forefrontal part of the I'm sorry, not the forefrontal part. Is the part of the brain that recalls everything, and usually it takes 20 minutes average for people to experience trauma for the first time. And for those who have suffered long history of trauma, the frontal cortex can be off in the linear way up to 2 days or more. So it is important to remember that they're not going to recall everything step by step right in the moment. So it's actually natural that they don't.
Hello, everyone. This is Josh again, and connected to essentially the premises of the myth that was just discussed, we're going to look at just the idea of false reporting and how inside of our culture it is highly prevalent that people think that the false reporting rate, specifically for instances of sexual assault, is much, much, much higher than what it actually is. We know that research has shown that it's really the same as all other types of violent crimes in terms of the rate of false reporting, and that's 2 to 8%. And so this idea keeps a lot of survivors from even wanting to report. It really does go back to that fear of not being believed if I say something, and whether that's engaging with law enforcement, telling friends and family, just not telling anybody for fear of not being believed, thinking that they're lying. We saw during the Kobe Bryant sexual assault case a number of years ago that survivors started to be discussed as the accuser, and this really does touch at the underlying premise here of this false reporting dynamic, that there's language being used that mitigates the impact on the survivor and that they were actually a victim of violence, and focuses more on the impact that it's having on the perpetrator, that that the survivor's coming out and falsely accusing the person for whatever reason. You know, when we see the star athletes or movie stars, they're after their money or something like that. Or here inside the slide we see, wanting to get attention or not wanting to be caught cheating. I've heard this type of myth for all of my life, and it's one that we really, really need to focus on. All the other myths are obviously just as important, but this idea of false reporting really is a large, large barrier to survivors not feeling like supported or that they will be believed if they do report. I think Bree has something to add.
Sorry, I keep jumping in. This is Bree. And something else that I think contributes to this myth, to get a little technical on you, is the way that sometimes cases are closed through the law enforcement process, and that a case may be what's called unfounded, which basically just means that there isn't enough evidence to show that a crime occurred. Doesn't mean something else didn't occur, doesn't even necessarily mean that a crime didn't occur. It's just that they can't get enough evidence to show that it occurred. And so that case will be unfounded. And sometimes those unfounding numbers get caught up in with other numbers. And so people will say, oh, these cases, so many cases were unfounded, those were false reports. But that it's not the same thing. And we've also seen nationally, I think, trying to think of one of the big cities that it happened in. I don't want to give a big city a bad name, so I'm not going to say one off the top of my head, but that there have been studies on particular police departments that show that they've been unfounding a lot of cases that shouldn't have been unfounded or closed, either because they don't have the resources to follow up, or maybe they don't have training, and so their officers buy into some of these myths. So we need to keep that in mind too, that sometimes the numbers that get rolled up into what might be considered false reporting are actually not false reporting. It's just the way a case is closed.
And there's some controversial research out there that really looks at the idea that the false reporting rate is up inside of the 40s percentiles, the 60 percentile, but all of that research is actually based off of those law enforcement reports that Bree was just talking about, and that there is just one officer making the determination on whether the case is unfounded, and then being able to close the case, and then it getting lumped into that false reporting dynamic. So with all of these, we know it's so important to really look at the quality of the research being performed, and where is all of the data for the research around these issues being collected from. So I am going to move into myths around or myths that affect male survivors, but before we move into that, I wanted to just offer up an opportunity for all of you to type into the chat and text box. Are there any other myths that you all would like to touch on, or that you kind of have burning in your thoughts right now as we've been moving forward with this? So I'm going to give it just a couple, maybe a minute here for you all to be able to work the fingers and type in any myths that you all would like to discuss about. So let me Okay. So go ahead and just type those in if they pop up. But for the sake of time, I guess I will continue to move forward, but we can stop and go back to any of the myths or the comments or the questions that you all pose as we move through this.
Or this is Bree, or are there myths that you're hearing in your community consistently, maybe that you don't have questions about, but that you're hearing, and what are your responses that other folks can learn from how you're responding to what you're hearing in your communities?
So we have one posed here. If a person has a mental health disability or issue, then they are not a victim. Let me reread that and think through it.
So I think what this person is saying is, so maybe if somebody is suffering from a mental health disability, that it doesn't affect them in the same way. We know that, for example, people with developmental disabilities are often thought of as asexual, and so the idea that, oh, it's not going to bother them because they don't, experience sex in the same way. So that could be a potential myth.
And this is Aguila. Another, I think the other way to look at this question also is to see that, especially on the hotlines, the crisis lines, we get to see a lot of people that we call repeat callers, correct? Mm-hmm. And we see them calling and talking and reporting their the different acts that are happening to them, but we take them like, no, this is a reporting, and this is an inappropriate caller who is actually has a mental disability, so therefore we don't take really seriously those calls, and we just discriminate them because we think they're talking about something that happened 20 years ago, so it is not right for them. So that's another way that we actually see them, and we tend to see people with mental disabilities.
And this is Bree. I remember a particular instance when I got called out to a hospital, and there was a young woman there who frequented the mental health hospital, and one of the things the nurse said to me was, oh, it's her again, she comes in all the time. But as an advocate, I really wanted to make sure that I was responding to this particular case and giving her the support she needed, because when we go back to what I had said before about perpetrators targeting folks who are accessible, vulnerable, and lacking in credibility, that is the epitome of that, right? Somebody who's repeatedly talked about things happening, somebody who has a mental health disability or a mental health disorder or a disability. So nobody's gonna believe them. So, it's kind of the cry wolf story. They cry wolf enough, nobody's gonna believe them, but then that perpetrator knows that, and they know that nobody's gonna believe them. So that puts them at extremely high risk for then being assaulted, because who's gonna believe them if they are?
The next one that I'm seeing here is actually, I haven't personally ever heard this phrase here, but wow, there's somebody that responded saying that they had worked with a Amish survivor of sexual assault, and inside of the community there was the kind of catchphrase or the ideology that a woman can run faster with her dress up than a man can with his pants down, and so therefore that puts the onus on the survivor. We see a lot of these sorts of culturally specific ideologies in terms of who's at fault, how should a survivor react to the situation when they're being assaulted, whether that's with a stranger or an acquaintance. Anything that anybody wants to add on to that one?
There's another cultural, this is Aguila, by the way, there's another cultural saying in Latin America that is, hold on to your chickens. I'm kind of interpreting because my little rooster is loose. So again, putting the responsibility on women, like women and the mothers, that they need to take care of their young ladies or their daughters, because it's not going to be their fault of the perpetrator or their son, the little rooster.
And this is Rana. I wanted to chime in because the last center that I worked at, we were actually right next to an Amish community, and we had many Amish survivors come and see us. And I would add here that I think it's really important, and this is kind of a little outside of the scope of this Debunking Myths webinar, but I think it's really important for us when we begin to provide services to communities like the Amish community or any other community that has a culture that is different from our own, that we really explore with that survivor what the cultural processes are for them, meaning is criminal legal always going to be the best system to employ, or do we check in with that survivor and talk about what are the cultural checks and balances that exist within your community, and how can we access that in a way that keeps you safe and holds the perpetrator accountable for their actions, whatever the word accountable means to you. And I know that in my work with the Amish community, that was a really interesting process, and how things kind of like run through the system as far as what options are available for survivors. And then even to this particular center that I worked at, we had a shelter, and making sure that our shelter was really accessible to all the cultural needs of the different survivors that we serve. So thank you for that question.
I'm going to read a couple more.
Yes. So there's one here. There are many people who believe that implied consent still exists when the two people are inside of the relationship. Who would like to field that?
Yeah, so this idea kind of gets back to marital rape or rape, in a dating relationship or ongoing relationship, that if you said once that you wanted to have sex, then that kind of opens the door for all future sex to be consensual and to occur. And we've really come a long ways in our society, although actually I do think there still are a couple states that where marital rape is on the books, saying that if you're married, then you are, but by default, agreeing to have sex whenever, and that choice is taken away from them. But what we know as advocates is that you are consenting every single time. And there was another one in here about if you were consenting to kissing, then you're consenting to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And we know that that's not true for any other behavior. I like the one that I've seen on Facebook a couple times as an example. I lent you my car once doesn't mean that you can come and take my car now whenever you want. So I think that's a good way of addressing that.
Next, we have a comment here regarding how many different types of myths we see around the LGBTQIA community, and the different ways that these myths get portrayed and permeate varying aspects of the culture. And I'm glad that that this was brought up, because we do realize that, or we see that sexual violence is, I'm going to connect in two responses here actually, that sexual violence is specifically focused on the power and control in that situation, the perpetrator's ability to have power, control, and victimize the person that they are violating. And this goes hand in hand with how oppression, this is a broader form of oppression and manifests due to oppression inside of our society. And so we do see increased rates of violence for individuals inside of the LGBTQIA communities, and we also see lower reporting rates for these communities, and it really does tie back into the oppressive dynamics in broader society that lead people to think that a gay man can't be sexually assaulted by a partner because of the overarching promiscuousness that people try to attend or put on individuals inside of these communities. And it's just simply not the truth. They're people they're just simply people like all of us. And so all of the myths that get put on these communities because they're misunderstood really go a long way to, one, not have a correct response to individuals inside of these societies, which lead them to not feel comfortable or safe looking for services after violence has happened inside of their communities, whether that's in a relationship or between acquaintances.
So this is Bree. We should probably move on, but this list that folks have typed up will be available with the recording. And, you know, we encourage you to continue talking with one another. Scroll through the list if you can during this. There are definitely a ton out there and ones that are kind of similar but take a little different angle. But the important thing to remember is that rape is always the fault of the perpetrator.
All right, so I'm going to get back on point here in terms of the slides that we have selected for today. And so I'm going to use a few images from Project Unbreakable to look at some of the myths affecting male survivors of sexual violence. So this one, we hear and see this one a lot of the time around when men do report either to law enforcement or inside of their families, inside of their friends circles. And it's really all wrapped up in the idea that, you know, masculinity promotes the ideas that men should be assertive and in control all of the time. And therefore they can't get raped, or they shouldn't be able to allow themselves to get raped if they're, you know, adhering to that masculine kind of gender box understanding. And it's really, really, really detrimental to male survivors in feeling, wow, if I do end up telling somebody that I was sexually assaulted, what are they going to think about me? And I'm not going to adhere to society's expectations of, you know, what a real man is, and recognize I'm doing the bunny ears. And when I say the real man kind of construct that we hear inside of our society. Here, this is essentially the flip side of the coin for the idea that men can't help themselves when they see a woman that meets that stereotypical expectation of attractiveness in our society. But here it's being used by the female to pressure the male for sex. And this really does open up the door and highlight the idea that, yes, predominantly men are the aggressors of sexual violence in our culture, but that anybody, any single identity can be the perpetrator and also a victim of sexual violence. Here, and I know we normally don't read slides, but I know it's kind of hard to read his handwriting here, so I'm just going to read these out loud. The quote is, "How can a girl rape a boy?" And he says, "Nearly everyone I tried to tell for the first 4 years after it happened, they responded to him in this way." And then the second picture here is the man up, and it's from his then fiance in response to the panic attack he was having caused by seeing his rapist for the first time since the incident had occurred 8 years previously. So there was also a comment inside of the questions after we asked for those around the idea of what if a man does have an erection and is sexually assaulted, but, you know, doesn't want to actually engage in that, but does get aroused. And there's a lot of misunderstandings around this topic. The physiological response system for men, and really this does apply to women as well, but we see it be a really, really damaging instance here for males, is they don't want to engage, but the physiological response of the arousal process for men doesn't take much for them to be able to get that erection. And so the sexual assault can happen, they can get an erection even though they are not a consenting party inside of that assault. And then the man up construct really does tie back into that idea of the masculinity and what how men are supposed to act. This is in the response to, you know, that panic attack, in that, okay, yes, the sexual violence happened, but men are supposed to be able to manage or own that and not be that highly emotional, have those panic attacks. They're supposed to be able to be in control of their emotions. So we are getting close to running out of time, so I will pass it over to Rana.
Sure. This is Agatha. Just one more comment that is related to the slide that Josh was just talking about, the myth. Is also, it kind of tangles up with the consent and coercion. You know, just because you're going along with it doesn't mean that you're consenting again to the act. So just making sure that we talk to survivors about that and clarifying, just because you're engaged to that doesn't mean that you were consenting and that you were going along with that.
Thank you, Agnes. This is Rana. And essentially the culmination of all of these myths is that it makes it harder for the criminal justice or criminal legal system to hold perpetrators accountable. And I don't know about folks on the phone, but or those of you listening to this webinar, but I can't tell you the number of prosecutors' offices that I walked in with a survivor to do the pre-filing interview, and at the end of the interview, the prosecutor said, "It's not that I don't believe you, it's just that I don't have enough evidence." And that became almost like an unfriendly anthem that I became accustomed to listening to when I was working with survivors in the criminal legal system. And I think what those prosecutors were saying was that it's not that I, disbelieve that this didn't happen to you, or like what Bree was talking about with those unfounded cases. It's just that I don't have enough evidence to be greater than the myths that the jury may hold, that the judge may hold, that the defense attorney is certainly going to try to paint a narrative of. And so what happens is that when we don't have a lot of cases going forward, you're going to have low conviction rates, light sentencing, and then it just perpetuates this idea of rape culture and all of the myths that we've been talking about today. And I think what's really important is that, victims are ultimately going to report when they feel supported and when they feel ready. And it's our job as advocates, as persons who work within the system, as friends, as family, as school officials, that we continue to dismantle these cultural norms and societal myths surrounding sexual assault so that all survivors have the opportunity to seek justice if and when they choose to engage the criminal legal system. And instead of asking survivors, what were you wearing, or what did you say, or you didn't say that the first time, or what did you do to cause the assault, we need to be asking the question, why did that perpetrator choose to sexually assault someone? And so, because I know we're running short on time, but I think that that kind of captures what this slide is saying. And then also, when we're talking about reporting, I think it's important that we add in to this discussion the idea that Colorado survivors seeking the forensic evidence collection process at a hospital have the ability for the anonymous reporting option. And so I want to give just a brief context and history for those who maybe weren't with us in 2015 when this legislation passed, and even before then. But in 2011, CCASA and DCJ, Office for Victims Programs, collaboratively reviewed 151 adult medical mandated reporting cases and surveyed 239 sexual assault response professionals, that being law enforcement, advocates, prosecutors, medical professionals, in order to determine how the reporting statute was interpreted and applied throughout the state. Findings of this study showed over half of the survey respondents encountered at least one victim who wanted to report the sexual assault but also wanted to remain anonymous. This finding was significant because anonymity was not currently presented as an option to the majority of victims in Colorado, and as a result, CCASA and a broad group of stakeholders passed legislation in 2015 to establish reporting options for adult sexual assault survivors. What's really important about this is that the reporting options allows the victim to dictate to nurses how they want to engage in the criminal legal system. So you're giving survivors more choices and options. And I think what's important for this discussion is that survivors have those options, and we are responsible for educating the survivors who walk in the door of our centers, of educating our medical professionals, our attorneys, and friends and family, like the community at large, that this option exists. So for those survivors who are having to traverse and navigate all of these different myths when they think about reporting or when they think about talking to someone, we need to be armed with the information to give them those different choices and options, one of them being the anonymous report. And I think we're probably going to dive into anonymous reporting in a different webinar. Is that correct? Okay, so I'm looking at my colleagues around the room and they're saying, yes, Rana, we are going to be talking about the ins and outs of anonymous reporting. But essentially what it does is it allows a survivor to have the forensic evidence collection to go through with the evidence collection process and the kit, and not report the crime to law enforcement. While law enforcement does come and like pick up the kid and maintain the evidence, they don't know whose evidence it is, so hence the term anonymous. And what the hope is that during the time from when the evidence is preserved to if and when that survivor wants to convert the case to a reporting case, that survivor is able to access support systems like people who believe them or like community-based advocacy centers where we can talk about how the criminal legal system works and give survivors all of their choices and options, where we debunk those myths that a survivor might bring to our doorstep, and we say, no, that's not true. It wasn't your fault. It wasn't because you were wearing a tank top. It wasn't because you didn't fight back. It wasn't because you were in the wrong or you let someone into your home. And when we allow survivors time and opportunity for greater information, then they can make a better and more informed choice to report. So I think that's it for me from anonymous reporting.
So this is Bree. So just some examples of how these things have played in. You've probably heard of some of these cases. The Wilkerson case was here in Boulder, where again we focus more on what the victim did or didn't do rather than the offender, and there's a lot more concern for the effect on the offender than the victim. And so in Wilkerson case we saw he got I think they waived the sexual assault crime, and he basically got 2 years of community supervision probation for the non-sexual assault crime. And so when we have big cases like these, what it does is it reinforces those myths and makes it harder for victims to come forward, because the media really likes these sensational cases, and these are the ones we see. And so the message that gets out there is that it was false reporting, it was the victim's fault, we don't want to ruin the offender's life. So these are all the types of things that victims are up against, and why it's good to have something like an anonymous reporting option so that we don't lose that evidence. Victims can get the medical care they need and have the time again to talk with supportive individuals who can help them then figure out what's going to be best for them. If that means going through the criminal justice system, it gives them time to build that rapport and feel more comfortable about that. Because when, we see a lot when victims don't report right away, then they question, well, why didn't they report right away? Well, if this was all you saw in the media were these different cases, you might not want to report right away either, and you would lose that opportunity to have the evidence collected, which might be important and help with that. Well, we just don't have enough evidence. So I think you all have heard about Denim Day, which is happening this Wednesday. It's something we promote throughout the state, and as I mentioned before, it's actually international, so it's a really great way to tie into what's happening across the nation and across the world, to wear jeans, and we have stickers, or if you have some stuff you can make up yourself. It's for a lot of advocates, we probably get to wear jeans to work every day, so it might not be as exciting, but if you can get some of your community partners on board, have them wear jeans, and people can ask, why are you wearing jeans? Or if we have a contest this year on social media, so if they want to be creative and wear a really creative outfit, maybe somebody will ask them, why are you dressed like that today? And then that can be a conversation opener for talking about myths and talking about how we can support survivors. That's wrap it up.
So that's the end of our presentation. We want to thank you all for joining us and all of the questions that you posed to us. We will allow everyone access to that. We'll type them up, and maybe that can spur some continuing discussions as we move forward. Please fill out the survey after we close out the webinar here. We really do appreciate all your feedback about all of this. And please feel free to reach out and contact any one of us about anything that was discussed today, as well as any other types of issues you might need assistance with or inside of your organization. So thank you all. Have a wonderful day.